This is a presentation on compliant communication with healthcare practitioners through digital platforms with your host, Darshan Kulkarni. Dr. Kulkarni is a principal attorney at the Kulkarni Law Firm.
My name is Darshan Kulkarni. I am General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer at Embedded Healthcare. I'm also principal attorney at the Kulkarni Law Firm, where we advise based on FDA, DOJ, OIG requirements, and we advise life sciences companies and their service providers. This is a really bad picture, but it is what it is. The goals for this talk are to review all digital communication to healthcare practitioners to ensure that they are compliant, to talk about the impact of communications that will assist a healthcare practitioner help patients. So in the end, we're coming at it from a patient-centric viewpoint. So we're going to look at the issue of trust and what the implications of that are. We're also going to look at how the FDA and the OIG, and the DOJ are looking at digital platforms. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, and that will actually dive directly into best practices to ensure digital communication remains compliant. So let's start from the beginning about why does it matter. We'll talk about that. We'll get into the expectations themselves. We'll talk about the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, the PDCA cycle, sometimes known as the Deming cycle, and how the Department of Justice basically interprets that and creates their own version of that. And we're going to talk about them in terms of the guidelines they put out recently in June, I believe. And we're going to end this with talking about best practices. So when you're talking about why it matters, you really want to start thinking about the regulatory consequences, and then think about the clinical consequences, and finally the impact on trust itself. And when you're thinking of regulatory consequences, obviously you start with the untitled letter. And the untitled letter, as we know, the FDA has in general been less rigorous than it did, say, 5 years ago. However, the communications that you are seeing from the FDA tend to focus on digital media, especially in the context of untitled letters. So you're seeing websites, you're seeing social media, all being implicated. That's interesting to a lot of people because a lot of people don't think of social media as something that the FDA is necessarily targeting, and because they'll think of YouTube maybe, and they might think about a Facebook page, which would be social media for sure. But the FDA is also looking at things like Instagram. FDA is also looking at things like Snapchat, to the extent it exists anymore. It's there, obviously. Then the FDA is expecting you to have a CAPA program. So if you did something wrong, how are you going to correct it? So most people focus on the CA part, the corrective action part, and forget about the preventative action part. And that's one of the most common mistakes I see when I'm helping companies. So what you might do is you might say, oh, this ad says something wrong, we'll put out a corrective ad. That's great. But what you didn't look at is why did you have an incorrect ad in the first place go out? What kind of processes do you have? Is this an SOP issue? Is this a training issue? Is this your MLR committee is not sort of composed of the right people? Each of those needs to be examined. Each of those needs to be considered. And then you need to audit that process. And we've had audits happen. And sometimes, let's be honest, the auditors don't know what they're talking about. But you need to make sure that you have the right people in the right place looking at the right things. Once that happens, you might every so often get quote unquote upgraded to a warning letter. And you generally see warning letters when you are thinking about, how should we put this? Either a really severe problem or you're looking at situations where the problem is consistent. And that's when the FDA through OPDP, Appleby, or CDRH comes through and cites you. You might see implications of your promotional efforts, whether digital or otherwise, in false claims. And that may obviously impact CMS and OIG, so Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or the Office of Inspector General, and they suddenly start getting more interested if you are making false claims that are changing prescribing habits. And that obviously, once you're communicating with HCPs, that becomes a real issue. Obviously, there might be penalties from that. You might actually get prosecuted. When you start thinking of civil penalties and you start thinking of prosecution, you need to start thinking about, is it against an individual or is it against a company? Obviously, company is bad enough, but individual is often worse because it might mean that you have a series of things that could happen to you. Everything from You get temporarily or permanently excluded from participating with HHS, which in the life sciences or in healthcare is a bit of a career killer. Or it might get even worse, and you might land up in a situation where you're permanently excluded, which obviously becomes problematic. Obviously, there might be monetary penalties associated with that, and there would, if you're a company, you might start looking at compliance obligations, which obviously becomes problematic. The next thing to think about are the clinical consequences. Obviously, there's the issue of inaccurate information coming out, and that's problematic by itself. And with COVID going on, you're seeing a lot of issues with clinical consequences, inaccurate information, everything from silver will cure COVID to here, drink some bleach, to individuals talking about drugs that have unproven efficacy being promoted for COVID, and obviously that's hugely problematic. And when those communications are again being directed to physicians, that becomes, well, I keep saying physicians, but I really mean healthcare practitioners in general, that becomes problematic. You also want to start thinking about the wasted financial resources. So if money is being spent towards one thing, CMS obviously isn't happy if they have to reimburse for that. And that can look at obviously patients getting the wrong drugs, patients getting the wrong devices, and that obviously has problems. You could also, because you are giving the wrong drug to the wrong patient at the wrong time, you could be looking at adverse events, and that's actually problematic for the patient as well. If you are giving the wrong drug to the wrong patient, again, I keep saying drug, but obviously devices are implicated as well, you might land up with an impacted diagnosis, especially if, for example, you might be looking at a device that is a diagnostic. And obviously that could impact your diagnosis. And then again, when you've got situations like for example, right now with hydroxychloroquine, you might have a situation where the hydroxychloroquine dose is missed because someone else is using it, and they're using it prophylactically to cure something that may not actually work. The next thing to start thinking about is, okay, you looked at regulatory consequences, you looked at clinical consequences. Why does it matter in the larger term, in the longer term? And it comes down to the issue of trust. In the end, marketers in life sciences companies, medical affairs in life sciences companies are trying to build trust with healthcare providers. And trust really comes in different forms, and different people measure it differently. I pulled this chart from Trust Across America, which actually comes up with their tap into trust anagram, I guess. And they talk about each piece of this. Truth, obviously, you have to ensure that you're providing honest information. And again, that's actually required regulatorily and legally. But that information often has to come ahead of professional or personal gain. And that helps with developing that trust. So medical affairs often will take the position that we're not in it for the sales, and that's appropriate, and that's a good thing. Sales often may be forced to be looking at their sales quotas that have to be met, and the impact of that could be the decrease in trust. Now, if companies and individuals took the position that, you know what, we're all on the same team, we're trying to make sure the patient gets better. How do we get there appropriately? That helps develop trust with healthcare practitioners, and that's going to be helpful. Accountability. You've got to make sure that you hold each other accountable. Do you have a sales rep or medical affairs person who's actually saying the wrong things? You need to make sure that you hold them accountable, call them out. Maybe you require additional training. Maybe you need to get the right SOPs in place. Maybe there simply isn't adequate information out there, and that there needs to be some kind of program out there, whether it's SOPs, whether it's training, whether it's other types of education. That accountability is going to be helpful in developing trust with healthcare providers. You need to look at the issue of purpose. Are you working with HCPs for shared purpose? You want to avoid those short-term wins. Maybe you can get this one prescription in for the long-term success, and the long-term success is the benefit of patients. And I know that most people I talk to, whether they're sales reps, whether they're marketing people, whether they are medical affairs, they're all in it to actually help patients. So if that's true, how do you communicate that shared purpose to healthcare practitioners? Integrity. It's not just these words. It's not just putting out these feel-good terms, but in the long-term everyday actions, is that consistent with what you say day to day? Notice. So we talked about integrity. We're now talking about notice, which is right here. Do you listen to diverse perspectives? Do you just focus on the needs of physicians because they're your prescribers, or do you also talk to the nurses? Do you also talk to the medical assistants? Do you also talk to the pharmacists? Each of those will play a massive role in what drug actually goes to the patient. The more you educate them, the more they believe in you. That's going to become really, really important. Talent. In the issue of talent, do you actually, if you're creating a compliance program to make sure that your digital compliance communication skills are appropriate, do you reward people who take the right steps? Do you align them with the company's purpose? Have you shared the company's purpose with your PRC committee, or are they just vendors who you haven't really brought into the fold, if you will? Because in the end, they are working with a common purpose. They are working with a common goal, with a common set of values. Openness. We're open and we're willing to learn. So you need to make sure that you are teaching individuals on a routine and consistent basis. And that helps. You may not know all the answers, but that openness actually helps. Transparency. Again, are you working in a situation where physicians think that your promotional pieces have hidden agendas? If you want to develop trust with physicians, with healthcare practitioners, you need to make sure that they see what you're after, why you're after it, and does that make sense to them? Do you have a quote unquote hidden agenda? Respect. Do you respect the nurses you're working with? Do you respect the medical the medical assistants that you work with? Each of those will play a big issue in trust. And I know physicians will say that sales reps and marketing people who share things with my team but don't respect them, I don't actually give them as much, I don't pay them as much mind, if you will. Understanding. You want to look at the issue of, do you celebrate success even if it's not your product? If a patient gets better, if that's what the business you're in, do you help and do you ensure that your promotional piece is geared towards helping that patient get better? You need to look at that over and over again. Safety. Do you call out unethical behavior? If you see people saying the wrong thing, do you call them out? And then tracking. You actually have a method of tracing and tracking what these patients are saying, what healthcare practitioners are saying, what everyone else in that team is saying. Each of those will help develop that trust, and that's gonna, not doing it will have regulatory and clinical consequences. So how do you do it? What you start doing is you start looking at what I refer to as the Deming cycle, but is also known as the PDCA cycle, coming straight out of the 70s. And they are talking about what's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. And what that really means is if you're going to have a compliance program in place, what you need to do is you need to first plan what problem are you trying to solve. You need to do so. You need to actually have the appropriate SOPs in place. You need to have policies in place. You need to have you need policies, you need SOPs, you need to actually have trainings in place and make sure people take the trainings. You set it up so that there are trainings but no one can attend because they're all busy working on something else. And then execute and let them do what they're doing and then go in and check to see what they're doing. Does it match what you trained them on? Does it match what your SOPs were? And then you need to go back and look at fixing what they're actually doing in a way that resonates with them. And this is a continuous process improvement cycle. So the DOJ really took that to heart and they've used this. The PDCA cycle is the core of the American Society of Quality, and the DOJ takes that and basically creates a compliance program out of it. They ask three basic questions. Is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? And does the corporation's compliance program really work? So they're talking about compliance in general. However, those principles are the principles based on which they'd look at prosecution afterwards. And again, this was last updated in June 2020, and obviously has implications on the company as a whole, but also within your individual group when you're talking about promotional compliance, and especially digital promotional compliance. So let's talk about each one of them. Is the corporation's compliance program well designed? So to do that, you examine the comprehensiveness of the program. Is there a clear message out there saying that misconduct is not well tolerated? So you don't want to just look at digital, even though this presentation is about digital HCP communications. You want to look at the program in general. How does it impact not just your digital, but also your offline? Because you might often be working your digital pieces in connection with offline communications. And does the program consider both? Is there a clear message that the misconduct will not be tolerated? If that's true, how do you make sure that's out there? So do you put out your compliance program and the requirements out on, say, an intranet, maybe an extranet? Are those policies available for all to see? Is there a policy and procedure assigning people responsibility, or is there a general, the company will do blah, blah, blah? So you need to go back and reevaluate your SOPs. Do you have a training program? How often does that training program occur? Is it consistent? And how often do people review that information? Systems of incentives and discipline. This ensures that the compliance program is well integrated into the company's operations. So do you reward people? And we talked about that in the context of trust, but do you reward people for doing the right thing, for coming forth and saying, you know what, I have a problem? You then look at risk assessment. How does the company identify and assess and define its risk profile? And this can come in multiple ways. Do you look at, for example, location of where your company operates? So do your digital market, do your ads, for example, target certain locations? Do you look at special risks associated with that location? Do you look at the competitiveness in, say, one market versus the other? And based on that, how do you create a compliance program that's specific, that considers, not specific, but that considers the increased risk? Do you look at the regulatory landscape, or do you sort of have a set of SOPs that were created originally? How do you look at potential clients and business partners and the risk that they specifically create? For example, do you use a ad agency who's never had experience? Do you train those ad agencies? What method do you have to ensure that they are kept up to pace? Use of gifts obviously becomes usually problematic. And each of those would be considered in that process. So to that point, you need to look at your risk management process. What methodology does the company have to identify the particular risks it faces? Maybe you have a spreadsheet, maybe you track on that spreadsheet. These are the new policies we have. Do you maybe have a strategic program that every year goes back and looks at, here's what we're going to try to do next year from a digital planning perspective? So it's sort of almost like having a publication plan, but applying it to your digital plan. And often, yes, you are doing things in a way that is responsive to opportunities that might arise in the market, but you need to have a general plan that you keep reassessing throughout the course of the year. Risk-tailored allocation. So do you spend a lot of money on Facebook or on Instagram? Well, how do you make sure that that money is being appropriately spent in a risk-compliant manner? So for example, if you're spending a lot of money on Instagram, do you use influencers? Influencers have recently gotten a lot of attention from the FDA. So how do you make sure that these influencers are compliant? Do you have a training program for them? Look at the revisions and updates. Do you sort of have a program from 1992 and you haven't updated it since then? And if you have, then that's going to cause a lot of problems. And then do you have a system of sort of going, okay, here's what we've learned so far. Here's what our program has. But you know what? We're starting to spend more time with 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 TikTok. And if we are spending more time with TikTok, do I have to worry about new risks that this poses, and how do I track that? Or maybe it looks at Instagram and you go, you know what, we haven't been doing this right. We haven't been training our influencers. If that's true, how do you bring them into the fold and how do you train them? And basically, how do you incorporate those lessons? The next thing you need to start thinking about are policies and procedures. So the companies expect to look at whether, and again, this is from the DOJ's perspective, do you have a code of conduct? And that's really useful when you're setting up your digital program. Do you have a core code of conduct that talks about commitment to relevant federal laws and regulations? If so, what is that code of conduct? And is that accessible to all the employees and to contractors who might be working on this? And do you have policies and procedures that incorporate this culture of compliance into its day-to-day operation? So you start looking at things like design. What is the company's process of designing and implementing new policies and procedures? And how does that change over time? You want to look at comprehensiveness. You want to look at, has the company made efforts to monitor and implement policies and procedures that deal with the new spectrum of risks it faces? So like we said, 5 years ago, off-label was a massive issue. Off-label remains an issue, obviously, but now patient access programs have started getting a lot of attention. Do you promote your patient access programs? Does that cause additional risks you have to consider? Accessibility. How has the company communicated its policies to its employees and to relevant third parties? So if doctors have problems with the way your ad looks, do you have a version of the bad ad program within your companies? That's something you should be considering. Are there linguistic problems? And how do you make sure that a physician who primarily serves in a Spanish speaking community has a way of appropriately addressing the concerns that he's seen? Maybe he sees ads that are non-compliant, and you've got to make sure that those problems are being addressed. Responsibility for operational integration. Who is responsible? Is there a general compliance is responsible, or MLR is responsible, or do you actually have a system for making sure that these policies and procedures are integrated? Are there any gatekeepers? And what if, essentially, who watches the watchers? How do you know that your compliance team itself is being appropriately trained? How do you know that your MLR and PRC teams are being appropriately trained? Is there an annual training program that you send them through? Effectiveness of the reporting mechanism is, when you start thinking about having an investigation process, you need to start thinking about the effectiveness of the reporting mechanism, the scoping, the response process, and the resources and tracking of results. So when you're talking about the effectiveness, you need to make sure that there is an anonymous reporting mechanism. So if, let's say, your marketing team, someone lower down the food chain in your marketing team goes, you know what, I think I have a problem. Do they have a way of saying this is a concern? And who do they communicate that with? Do they have to report it to the person who actually wrote it? In which case, that's a problem, because they may not feel safe doing that. Maybe there's a phone number that they need to contact. And this especially becomes problematic when you're thinking about false claims. And I've dealt with whistleblowers, and that's one of their concerns, which is they kind of go, I worked in sales, I worked in marketing, and I was constantly told that I should just put my head down and keep doing what I'm doing. And that becomes problematic. Properly scoped investigations by qualified personnel. So how do you determine which complaints and red flags get further investigation? How do you make sure that is everything a fire, or do you have processes that rank and list the concerns? So maybe you keep seeing Facebook ads becoming problematic. Well, maybe you need to consider having a special Facebook ad policy or procedure. And how is that independently reviewed, conducted, documented? And does someone go back and keep looking at that to make sure that that program is being appropriately monitored and changed and updated in response to the new findings that might come out? You also want to start looking at investigation response. And if do you have some kind of metrics to look at responsiveness? So if you find problems and you're tracking those problems, are you sort of keep seeing, oh, you know what, there's a Facebook ad, there's a Facebook ad, there's a Facebook ad problem. Do you go, okay, maybe that's 3 Facebook ad problems. Maybe we have a general problem with Facebook ads. So how do you do that right? Do you have the appropriate resources to track? So it's great if you have a program, but if you have no way to implement the program, that becomes hugely problematic. So is it basically a paper tiger, if you will? How do you manage third parties? How do you ensure that these third parties are consistent with the level of enterprise risk that's been identified by the company? How does the company ensure that there are appropriate controls? So if you are training, say, someone in promotional compliance, how do you make sure that they actually have the appropriate processes? So do you audit your advertising agencies? Do you audit your MSL contractors, if you will? Management of resources. So how do you look at the compensation incentive structures? Do you compensate marketing based on how much they push the envelope? And I've had marketing say to me, I've had sales say to me that if you don't have a warning letter, maybe you aren't doing it right. And that's hugely problematic. So from a compliance perspective, you need to make sure that the risk structure and the compensation structure aligns with your compliance program. Are there real actions and consequences? So let's say you've got a superstar who puts out great ads, gets great click-through rates. What is the impact of that? Does the company track those? And if those ads are non-compliant, what does that superstar get? Does that person still get brought up if they have problems? Could they be fired, or is that just not on the table? Is the corporation's compliance program adequately resourced and empowered to function properly? So you want to make sure that the senior and middle management show commitment, or is this just a paper tiger? You want to know that the MLR and other compliance resources have autonomy, and that that you have appropriate disciplinary and incentive measures available. The big question and the third question that the DOJ wants you to look at, that FDA needs you to consider, is the compliance program working in practice? So you need to look at the adequacy of the program. If misconduct was identified, if non-compliance was identified, what steps were taken to actually find it? Is that consistent with your program? How quickly did it catch it? Each of those would be things you have to be thinking about. And if you found it, was the program itself improved over time to catch these problems more often? So let's think about best practices at this point. When you're thinking of best practices, the number one good idea is to have clear policies. Too many people don't have policies and are mostly winging it, and this is mostly a recipe for disaster. Define your audience. Are your HCP communication strategies mostly reaching out to formulary committees, or are they reaching out to one-on-one physicians? These have dramatically different ramifications, and the FDA has different guidances on each of those. So that are you communicating off-label? Are you communicating HEOR information? Again, that will have very different types of communications associated with it. Patient assistance programs are under special review. You're seeing a lot of those pop up more and more. Also keep an eye out, for example, I don't have this on the slide set, keep an eye out for the OIG bulletins that you might have, and they have some really interesting communication that you should consider reading and being up on. Those opinion letters become really useful to look at. What evidence do you have? You see this over and over again when you look at promotional compliance. People get their competent and reliable scientific evidence standard mixed up with the substantial evidence standard, and how do those two make sense when you're making specific types of claims? Is your claim a clinical claim, or is it a safety claim, or is it a economics-based claim? Each of those would have different standards associated with it. Is it an ease of use claim? Influencer programs. I talked about it a few minutes ago, but if you're using influencers, like say a patient advocate who's talking about their diabetes pen, well, if you're doing that, and you'll see that every so often, you've seen companies do that, make sure that you have an appropriate training program for them. Do you hire celebrity doctors? Do you hire celebrities? Those would all have, you need to have appropriate training programs for them. And again, you want to have a policy that talks about how you'll engage with patients, how you'll engage with physicians. Do you have a celebrity doctor that you use? You'll see that every so often. And what are the implications of that? Do you actually focus on websites, or do you focus on Instagram, or do you focus on ethereal promotional posts like on Snapchat or Instagram, the instant version that disappears after a while? Each of those would have special focus. HCP specific considerations. Are you promoting on Doximity or on Medscape? What are the implications of that? Is your piece showing up next to an ad for your drug? Does that render the whole process off-label? We had a situation where cannabis ads started popping up next to our product. Well, what do you do then? Can you control the ads that pop up next to your promoted post, if you will? Are people making comments on your Facebook page? How do you ensure that those comments are appropriate? FDA regulated products start showing up. I mentioned cannabis, but you also see this in the context of pharmacogenomics and pharmacogenetics, where you start looking at drug-specific communications that may be completely off-label, or talking about the efficacy, your responsiveness to certain responsiveness to certain drugs. And if those ads haven't been verified, or you start making claims about that, you might start having problems. Cannabis becomes a huge issue. COVID cures becomes a huge issue right now. And each of those will have impacts on just what issues you need to start thinking about from a compliance perspective. Again, if you are targeting people based on digital marketing, do you have to think about HIPAA? Do you have to think about TCPA? Do you have to think about CCPA or GDPR? Each of those need to be considered as you continue. If your product is in the AIDS space, each state may have very different laws on how you can communicate with patients. Each of those has to be considered. If you are a physician, do you target, for example, physician offices using geofencing? Well, what are the implications of that? Each of those needs to be considered as you continue. If any of these made sense, if you still have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I went over just a little bit over, but you can reach out to me at DarshanTalks, or you can reach out to me at darshan@kulkarnilawfirm.com. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I wonder if you guys have any questions, but I'll be around.
If you would like to contact Darshan with questions about your need for compliant healthcare practitioner communications, you can reach Darshan on Twitter at Kulkarni Law Firm, or the firm's website, kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com.